Okay, today we're going to start talking about the role of the European Union, and I'm going to be honest that the kind of future of how well the EU functions or will continue to function will be something that's kind of hotly debated across the next couple of months or years, depending on however long it takes for the British Parliament to invoke the Article 50 to actually withdraw from the European Union. As you saw in the video clips at the end of the UK lecture, where we kind of talked about growing trends of Euroscepticism. It will be a question of, will other people follow suit, given the kind of broad range of elections throughout Europe, throughout the rest of early to mid 2017. We'll see if more political parties that are kind of anti EU or anti like one Europe policies will be successful. So all of this stuff could be interesting to learn and know, and then become functionally irrelevant if the political landscape of Europe continues to evolve in the way we think it. So before we break down the European Union into a couple of different sections, we probably should first have a good working definition of what the European Union is. Currently, there are 28 member states, and I'll show you a list of specifics when we get to a history section. There are roughly 500 million members of the individual countries that are member states, which accounts to 7.5% of the global population, 30% of the globe's GDP, and around 60% of the development assistance that is offered from one area to the rest of the world all comes from the European Union. It was kind of created under some shared common European values, and those would be things like liberty, democracy, a respect for rights and freedoms, and rule of law. So really, if you want to talk about an organization that was kind of created to promote, liberal democracy throughout the rest of the world, or at least throughout the continent of Europe, that is the goal of the European Union. That looking at that values list kind of highlights several of the kind of classical tenets of kind of a classical liberal political philosophy. Beyond its kind of statement of values, as you see from the statistics on the left, it's the largest economic body. It has been the most successful model to date of kind of integrating regional policies into a governmental body. The success or the questionable success of the European Union has led people to look at other similar bodies like the African Union or ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to see if it's possible for groups to kind of come together and have a shared sense of regional governance. It's unique because it is kind of a semi-confederacy, because instead of the member states necessarily determining how much power they wish to kind of cede or how much sovereignty they're willing to give up to the large body, they really give up as much as they want to or need in the name of kind of promoting the idea that this government can or should function. And that's really been a sticking point for a lot of people, especially those in the United Kingdom. The idea of giving up sovereignty in the name of a singular kind of European vision is something that the Leave campaign really sat on, that they think that they are a different set of circumstances from the rest of Europe, that they should be treated differently, they shouldn't have to accede to some of the same policies, and they think that the Parliament of the United Kingdom is far more effective at dealing with individual issues than the European Union or the European Commission or their parliamentary body is. And that's the argument that's really starting to resound throughout the rest of Europe. This kind of wave of Euroscepticism is starting to ask the question, does this supranational organization, does this large governing body have the best interest of Europe in mind, or do the best interest of individual member nations supersede kind of the collective vision for Europe? So in order to break down the EU, we're going to look at a couple of different themes, and I think the first thing will be looking at kind of the history of the EU. Why did it come together? You know, were there earlier versions of a European body that preceded the EU? And before we do that, we kind of need to talk about the concept of supranationalism. Supranational organizations are organizations that are not totally sovereign actors. These tend to be large international bodies or even large regional bodies that focus on integration. The goal of a supranational organization is to pool sovereignty to increase political, economic, or social clout. And right, the EU is not the only supranational organization. Earlier I mentioned the African Union or ASEAN. You could talk about the United Nations as a supranational organization. You could talk about kind of a defense pact organization like NATO as a supranational organization, that these are groups coming together kind of believing that there is strength in numbers, or that a collective body can solve a similar problem for everybody in kind of one broad stroke instead of a patchwork of individual solutions. So the birth of the idea of the European Union shows up after World War II, when functionally everyone throughout Europe was dealing with just a crappy post-war economy. They were dealing with the aftermath of World War II really rampaging throughout Europe. And they all were facing the same kind of challenges, kind of this need, this desire, this will to kind of rebuild and restore Europe after the Second Great War. And originally, the European Union was created solely to focus on economic development and economic repair after the Second World War. But before we get to that, in 1949, we see kind of the Council of Europe, which is one of the early predecessors to some of the institutions that exist as part of the European Union now. So it was kind of seen as a body that could eventually be some form of provisional government, but it really didn't have any power. It didn't have a lot of people buy into it right away. It was not seen as any kind of authority. Think of like the problems that the League of Nations dealt with in terms of its quest for legitimacy, and when some, larger nations were unwilling or questioning the efficacy of the League of Nations, that body kind of folded. 1950 is where you see kind of the first economic body with some degree of strength show up in Europe, and it was formed to kind of coordinate coal and steel industries. That after the war, manufacturing in Europe was somewhat successful because you needed strong manufacturing to be the engine of a war effort, but that would also be one of the first things that could be attacked by an outside enemy, right? That if you want to hurt somebody's ability to fight, you hurt somebody's ability to build things or be economically productive, and that kind of disrupting force will challenge their will or kind of render them useless on the battlefield once they run out of supplies. So instead of looking for a bunch of arbitrary competition, you saw this body kind of come together to coordinate policies dealing with all things coal and steel in the name of kind of reinvigorating production of raw materials and eventually manufacturing in Europe. In 1957, this body evolves into the European Economic Community, or the EEC, which was established the Treaty of Rome. And this was functionally a free trade agreement. that the goal of the EEC under the Treaty of Rome was to create what's called the common market, where there were no tariffs between members of the EEC, that there was more free trade. It was about everybody kind of growing at equal rates and not disproportionately, trying to impair individuals or kind of attack them through what people would perceive as protectionist measures with high import or export duties. As that body kind of grew with fairly decent degrees of success, you see this evolve into what's called the European Community. 1965, the European Community was established, and it really expanded the original function of the European Economic Community to look at issues beyond economics. And really, the kind of first big non-economic project of the European Community was to focus on peaceful use and development of atomic energy. You saw some push for denuclearization through this body, but you also saw kind of people looking at the possibility of like nuclear power or other ways to kind of wield this new great and destructive force that really kind of grows into its own around World War II. It's not until 1991 where we see kind of the birth of the EU as we know it today. In 1991, we see the Maastricht Treaty, which created the European Union functionally as we know it today. It increased the size and scope of power that the body had under its previous iteration of the European Community. And the goal, again, started as an economic focus. And the goal of coordinating economic policy kind of came through this vision as a single European currency, the euro. And you'll remember in some of the little clips we watched from Thatcher and John Major speaking, and then later on as we look at like the role of Tony Blair as the Prime Minister in the UK, the fear of eliminating a nation's currency and kind of joining a greater economic community, especially through the symbolic gesture of everybody using the same means of purchasing power, is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people. And you saw, several impassioned speeches by both members of the Conservative and the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, kind of rallying for or against this single common currency. And everybody thought if continued economic growth was the real name of the game, then you eliminate artificial growth or competition of one country's economy over another through the inclusion of a common currency. This, for the longest time, was probably the most divisive part and still continues to be one of the most divisive parts of the EU's economic policy. This same treaty in 1991 established what are called the three pillars of the European Union, and it's the three spheres of authority they have. It looks at trade and economic cooperation to kind of build off of previous policies. Second, it looks at common law enforcement practices and human rights authority. And then third and finally, starting to look at both foreign policy and European security measures in terms of like defense commitments and things like that. So the European Union kind of radically evolves from its origins of being a toothless organization into a cooperative that deals with coal and steel into kind of this now large supranational organization that has, three huge realms of policymaking over just an economic area. And when you look at kind of the basis of the EU, right? The name of the game is establishing rule of law and democracy. It wants to make itself clear that it's not eliminating the sovereignty fully of its member nations, that it's not eliminating the government of its member nations, but it's a quest to pool sovereignty to deal with common problems, kind of challenging the entirety of Europe as a whole. That the EU can only gain or lose power through alterations to this 1991 treaty, or new treaties that kind of come after the fact, to kind of allow this argument to grow and prosper. We'll take a break here, and when you come to the second video, we'll look at what it takes to be a member of the EU, and we'll start to look at the individual institutions of the European Union.